Welcome to Therapy Inspired. As therapists, we have a unique view of the world. We hold space for grief and trauma, yet we also witness resilience and healing, all while being humans ourselves. We hope to share helpful psychoeducational insights from our world as psychotherapists in and out of the therapy room. And while we'll be talking about things therapy related, listening and engaging in this podcast doesn't equate a client therapist relationship. And though we might be using insights from our work with various clinical issues, we don't reference specific cases. Hi, I'm Kameela Osman. I'm a registered social worker and a psychotherapist. I have a clinic in Bowmanville where I see in-person clients, elite counseling and consulting services, and I do virtual therapy throughout Ontario.
My name is Darby Crosby, and I'm the owner of Crosby Counseling and Wellness, which offers virtual services to anybody in Ontario. I see individuals, couples, and families. I also offer supervision of clinicians. And so here today, we are about ready to talk about difficult conversations, because there are those moments in which we have to talk to somebody about something that's a little bit hard to do. And I think it's really important to give it a little bit of thought. So usually difficult conversations, the actual subject matter is not as difficult as the emotions that I feel, my anxiety around how I think you're going to behave or how difficult it is for me to use the words. Is that what you found, Camilla?
Yeah, I think yes. And so the anxiety of even just how do I bring this up? And sometimes what I see is like both people know that difficult conversation needs to be had, but there's that apprehension of are we ready? Or especially if things are going well, things are going well. I don't want to rock the boat and address that. So as you said, it's that emotional hesitation. Why do you think people fall into that avoidance trap?
I think it's more about I'm worried about what you're going to think of me or you're going to think when I say it. And I think also for conversations between couples, it may have been a conversation that we've already had like 10,000 times, right? And so it's kind of loaded.
Yeah.
So how can I say we really need to talk about this again without it sounding like I'm blaming my partner?
Yeah.
Right. And what is it? I think we also have to figure out what it is that I want to say. Like, why is this bothering? Why is this difficult? So that it's not, it's your fault. It's your fault.
Yeah. With that, we're talking about this again. I see that a lot where it's almost like already loaded. We're quick to dysregulation because the last time we had this, it should have been resolved. I think that's the mindset that should. And what we forget is that a lot of our conversations are in fact perpetual. I use the Gottman method of couples therapy, and this is one of the things they talk about, that I think it's about 69% of our conversations are perpetual. And that's not to say it's hopeless. The idea is if we accept that this is an ongoing thing, like parenting, for example, we're not going to, it's not solvable. We're not going to talk about one way of parenting and then that's it. It's not a one-off conversation. We're going to revisit this, but we could also revisit things like intimacy, our needs for intimacy and what's going on in our life might be one of those perpetual conversations. In-law relationships, for example, is another perpetual one. That those represent some of those difficult conversations. And if we can accept that we may need to revisit this, it also takes out that intensity of almost fatigue that comes on. Why are we talking about this again? This should have been resolved. We start opening up to it's okay that we're talking about this again. And hopefully we're talking about it in a different way. Hopefully we're building upon where we left off last time. And it's a little bit of like reminder and going forward.
Or even just checking in with the other person, like, because sometimes, like you were saying, intimacy, like maybe our intimacy is, we're becoming more distant because of work and parenting pressures.
Yes.
And so we agree that we're going to do something. We're going to have a date night. We're going to do whatever. And we get caught up in our world. So, we don't actually do that. So that perpetual conversation comes back to things like, how did we do last week? What got in the way? Right. And again, we don't want that to be sort of an accusational kind of a thing. We want it to be sort of organic, like, so yeah, I know I should have done this and it was really hard because work had this pressure, or I was so tired because of the kids, like,
Yeah.
and then it becomes a brainstorming, an idea of how we can work on things. So it's not just, you're not doing it. It's a collaboration to try to fix something.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mhm.
What are those tips for how to start that conversation that you've come across?
So often what I'll ask clients is, what is it that you want to say? Like,
Mm,
why is this a problem? Right?
mhm.
Sort of to sort of get an understanding of their perspective of what the problem is. And then once they can sort of speak about what their issue is and what they need and how they think it might be helpful to sort of repair this,
Yeah.
then they are able to speak from themselves. And it's not, constant, like I've said multiple times today, like it's not your fault. It's
Yeah.
this is what I want to contribute. So I think that's partly
Yeah.
the problem, is that the way we speak English is we often want to say, you're the problem.
This and
Yeah.
naming the you as the problem. I agree that those I messages, those I statements, I used to call them I messages, and I realized since like the iPhone, clients get confused when I say that. So those I statements of I'm feeling this, I'm needing this is hard for me. And you're right. I feel like it comes back to semantics. We're taught almost like that's self-centered, but it
Mhm.
actually works to diffuse defensiveness when we're talking about ourselves. We're not blaming, we're acknowledging this is my need and I'm
Mhm.
asking for support. And I think that's the other piece, I
Yeah.
think, with a lot of the difficult conversations. If we can identify what's our need, want, expectation that's about us, and
Mhm.
we're then kind of managing it into what's our request of our partner.
Right.
That request goes a longer way than if we were to come from a place of criticism.
Right.
You're not doing the dishes, versus, I need some help, or it's hard for me when I did them before I left for work
Right.
and I come back home and the sink is full again. That's a different conversation than, you never do the dishes, or you're inconsiderate, and all of those types of semantics.
And maybe it's not a question of the other person putting the dishes in the dishwasher, but maybe it's like when we put things in the dishes to be put in the dishwasher later, they need to be put in a more like they need to be rinsed or stacked in a different way, right? So it's not always that the other person has to do a specific task
Yeah.
or the chore, but it's how can we brainstorm to do things together. And that happens a lot with families because the kids will just leave things on the counter or whatever. No, we need to get them placed in the sink and,
Mhm.
or whatever with water in them. Right. And so it's a way of being able to sort of help.
Mhm.
Right.
It's interesting. I find that, we're on this as an example when it comes to difficult conversations, because it's not one that people will often think about is a difficult conversation, but it's interesting from a therapeutic lens. Like these are the things that come up in couples therapy that, it sounds really silly that we're spending time talking about this, but it's that perpetual nature of it. It comes up so often that it later becomes a difficult conversation. Yeah.
Because I'm exhausted hearing it and I'm exhausted that we're not changing it.
Yeah.
And then it becomes sort of a barrier, like
Mhm.
between my partner and myself, right?
Yeah.
Because now we don't want to talk about it, and this great big elephant is sitting between us.
Yes.
And yet it could be really easily fixed,
Mhm.
like the toilet seat argument, and,
Yeah. Yeah.
putting the kids to bed and who's going to bathe them tonight. Like
Yeah.
those things are very frustrating, but they can be solved.
Yes, exactly. I do also think, when it comes to starting those conversations, if we can open up to a curious mindset, that makes a big difference. I often see that couples will try to get the other person to hear their perspective. So I'm trying to prove my point when we enter this conversation that's already
Good
loaded.
point.
It's already
Mhm.
loaded, and then we're trying to talk about, pulling the other person into our perspective rather than slowing down and listening. So if we each can approach it with, I'm entering this conversation to learn more about what's going on for that person. Let me first understand what are they thinking before I share
Right.
my thoughts. We can't, make the assumptions of what they're thinking before we enter into that conversation.
Absolutely. And I think that sometimes we don't listen well. Like we may
Mhm.
hear the first 5 words and then we're already forming an
Yes.
answer to that, right? Which also impairs, our communication, right? Because you're not hearing my whole statement,
Yeah.
right? And then I don't feel heard because you only answered part of what I just said.
Yeah.
So I think you're right. That slowing down is really,
Mhm.
really important, and sort of
Mhm.
being really open to what the person's saying. and, not taking offense or not feeling that I'm being blamed, right, for everything. But that takes skill
Mhm.
for me to say things to you without it sounding like I'm blaming.
Yes. A very interesting exercise that I try sometimes in therapy, it's called the imago dialogue or sometimes a mirroring dialogue. I'm sure you've used this at times. It's so interesting when couples practice this. It's an exercise of just listening to the other person, and it's usually a short, concise statement. They may share, I it would be really helpful if you understand, or it's important to me that you know X, Y, or Z, and they're sharing some of their feelings or insights as to what's happening for them. So again, it's about them. And the other person is tasked with, can you repeat back? Can you mirror back what that person says? And it's so interesting to see how the statement to interpretation can go awry. That right there starts to tell me as a therapist and clients, they have that insight then as to what happens when they're talking to each other. You say this and the other person is thinking something completely different. Their interpretation of it is further. And I actually, an interesting part of that is I find that happens more the longer the couple's been together. You would think
Yes.
that happens less, but it's because you've been together so long, there's more assumptions to what you intend. And so we're mind reading and filling in these gaps that aren't exactly accurate.
Well, and also we have more distractions if we've been together longer.
Mm.
Work is harder. If we have children, children are also more challenging and stuff. But that's an excellent sort of example for people also to realize that it's not that somebody's not, it is intending not to follow through or not to understand your point of view, but it's just the way they're hearing the conversation. And usually that exercise demonstrates a really bad telephone exercise. Like I said,
Yeah.
can you get milk from the store? And the other person said, you want me to do the shopping,
Yeah.
right? Which is completely different, right? And understandably how,
Mhm.
I could get agitated because I just had a full day and now I have to do
Mhm.
shopping. Like, so again, what we want to do is to be able to express, that we're trying to help each other. We're not attacking each other and
Right.
working that way.
Yeah. And I'd often suggest like practicing some of that active listening in that way, attuning to, trying to stay with the words the person is saying instead of, as you mentioned, getting into your own head. Sometimes I call it the mental war room. They say something that activates you, and suddenly you're isolated. You're not hearing the other person anymore. You're looking for your own ammunition, and we end up in tit for tat conversations. And so, really coming back to practicing, can I be mindful in this conversation? Can I, if I don't understand something or I feel activated by something, instead of running with that defensiveness or from that activated place, can I get curious? Help me understand, or that feels harsh, even sharing what your experience is, that feels
Mhm.
harsh, or I feel a bit offended. Maybe I'm understanding. Try to give them the benefit of the doubt and get curious about what's happening. I find that also is a pathway forward in some of that gridlock that can happen with
Yeah.
those heavier dialogues.
Absolutely. And I think it also works with our children, right? Because our children want to do what our children want to do. And we are saying, no, you have to go to bed now. And then we get into this sort of pseudo sort of power struggle. And, if we slow down our conversation and say, so what's really going on here? I don't want to go to bed. Well, it's 8 o'clock and you always go to bed at 8 o'clock. So how can we do this and, make it a little
Mhm.
less challenging?
Yeah.
Should we race to the bedroom? Who's going to get there first, right? So that we can do things that make it more engaging and less
Yeah.
me telling you what to do.
Absolutely. And then, as you mentioned kids, I think it highlights because a lot of these things sometimes we know and we'll be more open to doing with our kids. But when you bring
Right.
it to the partner level, we feel a bit more defensive. And so it reminds me of that other
Yeah.
strategy that I use with my kids and suggest is to offer alternate options. So bedtime is still at 8. That's our framework. But, maybe tomorrow we could do this, or remember this is on the schedule, and that bit of it's not bribery. It's really, this was already planned, and we're just, refreshing the memory that this is this time for this, and that is that time for that. If we can bring some of this not now or not this, but this or then to our adult and partner relationships, we may find that there is room for compromise.
Absolutely. And I think with our kids, we know that we have to repeat ourselves. We know that we're going to have these little
Mm-hmm.
struggles. but we look at our partners and saying, you're an adult, I shouldn't have to do that, right? And it's not that we're parenting our partner, it's we're giving our partner the same grace that we would give a person we really cared about or respected, but we get impatient with our partners because they should know. They should mind read and know everything.
Yeah,
And that's not
absolutely.
fair.
I do think it's that judgment that comes in, and I find one of the things to notice is if you find yourself thinking like that, question the lack of compassion, the judgments you have of yourself. You probably, if you're projecting some of that onto your partner, you probably are holding yourself to some of those high standards.
Right.
And as you practice giving yourself more grace, it's more natural that you're going to
Absolutely.
open up to different perspectives and grace for your partner as well.
And I think that, we brought up some really good points in terms of looking at our own anxiety about having the conversation. The idea that we know that this, if it's a perpetual conversation, that this may be greeted with less optimistic, sort of approaches. And how can we set things up to make it more favorable? Right? How can we create an opportunity? Do we have to say, I really want to have a conversation, or
Yes.
whatever? And I think it's really important that we can do those things and slowing down the conversation and understanding it's not about blame, it's about co-collaborating in terms of trying to solve things that bother me and bother you.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree, Darby. And so definitely I do think that scheduling, that checking in, it doesn't have to be scheduling, that might be the wrong word, but that checking in, do you have the capacity to have this conversation is a really
Mhm.
important piece. And then as we said, the curiosity and the other tools that we mentioned, trying to be in that active listening space makes a difference. In the worst case scenario, things get heated because it is a heavy conversation. I always suggest take the time out, take that healthy break. And I often say take it in a healthy way. Where people get resistive to healthy breaks is if they feel activated by the other person
Right.
walking away, whether that's I'm fearing that you're gonna, go use substances or, call an ex, or sometimes it's our
Mhm.
attachment style. I feel that you walking away means the end of our relationship, and there's some activation from that end of things. So I often will suggest taking that healthy break in a way that names where you're going, what you're doing, and when you'll be back. So there's a bit of closure and containment to it. There's the recognition that the break is for a purpose. And then there's definitely acknowledgement that we are circling back. There might be times where you come back from that break and you're activated all over again. And that says, try a
Right.
different time. You need more time
Right.
to cool off.
And that's what I say too, is if you say, I just need a 5 minute break, and then you sort of get yourself under control and you come back and you think, I'm still not there, then I think it is okay to say,
Yeah.
can we pick this up tomorrow after we put the kids to bed? Because then it gives both of you a little bit of space to look at really maybe where things went awry in that conversation and what it is that I really want to say.
Yeah.
Like, how do I really want to solve this problem?
Yeah, yeah.
So,
Especially
and
with those perpetual conversations from my therapeutic lens. I don't know about yours. I feel and support the sleep on it. And it's not the don't go to bed angry is what you'd hear from me. It's the go ahead and sleep on it, get a fresh
right.
perspective. Also, I will say like don't argue too late into the night. Think about what's your saturation point, and you can come back to it. If it's an ongoing issue, there's no harm in holding off for another day,
It'll be there tomorrow.
unfortunately. But yeah, fortunately and unfortunately, yeah.
That's right. Well, thanks for joining us here on Therapy Inspired. We look forward to seeing you in a couple weeks. Bye-bye for now.
Mm.